So much for joining us. It's yet another conversation that we are having today at Silver Talkies, but on a very unique topic, because to me, it feels very personal. It feels very empowering as well to be talking about a topic which usually all of us kind of shy away from. And I'm also one of those guilty as charged that I find it very difficult to actually even have that phone call with someone who's had a bereavement in the family or of a loved one. And I find I'm always at loss for words. I really don't know what to say, what to do. And while my heart really cares, but my mind probably does not really cooperate in finding those words or approach it rightfully. So this was one topic which I have had on my mind for a while now, and it was triggered by a conversation that we had a few months ago with Dr. Seema and Dr. Roop Gursahani at BIC at one of our previous events, where we were talking about things like living will and advanced medical directive, and we had a conversation around end of life care and also about end of life care and also about palliative care. And ever since then, I think that conversation, this has been a topic on my mind, that how do you really normalize discussions on a very difficult topic that seems to be death? How do you really have that conversation? Is there a way to really have that conversation without any discomfort, without any feeling of guilt, without any, without considering it as a taboo? So, many people kind of talk, the minute you mention death, your elders will say, no, don't talk like that, as if it will bring death right there and then if you were to even mention the word, right? I have had funny instances where my daughter may have just playfully said to her dad, I'll kill you. And my mother-in-law will like, you can't talk like that, right? So how like even mention of a word like death is considered to be a taboo. It considered to be very inauspicious, right? And I'm sure it has a lot of trauma, a lot of superstitions kind of attached to it. And maybe there is a way to kind of break those norms. And I'm really, because I really liked something which Dr. Seema mentioned to me, right? Death is the only certainty that we have. Death is certain. It's only the time when it will come is something which we do not know, but it's definitely certain and inevitable for each one of us, right? So why not just accept it? And keeping in mind today's topic, which is creating compassionate communities, where we always refer to compassion for the living, why not really look at compassion even for the dying and their family caregivers and their family members? So that's what brings us to today's session. So thank you so much. So today's session is hosted by Silver Talkies. I think many of you already know about Silver Talkies, but I'll keep a quick introduction for those who are joining us for the first time. Silver Talkies is an engagement and a community platform exclusively for the 55 plus. And our intention with Silver Talkies has always been to promote healthy aging. And how do we do that? We actually have a concept called Silver Talkies Club, which is a social networking and engagement platform where anybody who's 55 plus can become a member by paying a nominal subscription fee of 4,000 rupees for the entire year. And in turn, you become a part of this very lively and vibrant community of, people of your age group who are all 55 plus. So our youngest member is 55 and our oldest member is 96. That's the kind of community group we have. And each one comes with a very unique sense of their take on life, in terms of I think they're all bound by one common thread, that they all want to age well and age gracefully and with dignity. So we do a lot of engagement programs, conversations like these, sometimes which happen in smaller groups as well. We have had listening circles where our members get to talk to a counselor and they share their things. We have story circles. We also have very fun events also. We just concluded a very big event in Bangalore, which was our annual event around World Elders Day, where many of our members who came from different cities were were on the stage participating in fashion show, in a dance and music program. They did theater, they participated in an art exhibition. So it was like a celebration of life and of age. And the unique part of that celebration was that it was an intergenerational event where they were actually performing with students of Christ University from the Department of Sociology and Social Work. They were participating with students of JD Institute of Fashion Technology, and they were corporate professionals who were doing this, the theater program with them. So it was a very beautiful, combination of age groups, different generations coming together. And we saw many beautiful stories emerging from it, where the youngsters were also very enthused and inspired by the energy that they saw among the older adults. So having said that, so I think anybody who's 55 plus, and if this is something which excites you as well, you're most welcome to look up Silver Talkies. We will shortly share details about us in the chat group. So for today's discussion, we have two guests, Krittika Sharma, who is joining us from Toronto. And then we have Dr. Seema Rao, who's joining us from Karunashraya. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give a quick introduction about both of them, and then I'll just tell you how we will run today's session. So Krittika is the founder and creative director of Maajhi, an initiative that creates experiences and tools to empower people to prepare for the end of life in meaningful ways. She has 13 years of experience in research, behavior design, and creative strategy. She's also the former director of Death Over Dinner in India, and which was the largest social campaign in the globe that has had over 2 lakh dinners. And she was the one who introduced the concept in India. As a senior strategist and engagement manager, she was a core team member who conceived, built, and launched the first global end-of-life collective, a digital platform for caregivers, care seekers, and service providers. Welcome, Krittika. Then we have Dr. Seema Rao, who is the Associate Director, Education and Research from Karunashraya Institute for Palliative Care Education and Research. She's an experienced psychiatrist and palliative medicine specialist with a keen interest in geriatrics and palliative care. Dr. Seema is skilled in psychotherapy for end-of-life issues like dignity therapy, spiritual care, research, mental health counseling, and pain management. She completed her postgraduate studies in psychiatry from Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, Bangalore. And she has also done her master's in palliative medicine with distinction from Cardiff University, UK. She was awarded the Commonwealth Scholarship to pursue her MSc. That's a very stellar CV, Dr. Seema. I really had to cut it short, and it was a very, very difficult task for me. So lovely to have you both. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Nagesh, thank you so much for connecting me to both of them. And we're really looking forward to this discussion today. So yes, Krittika and Dr. Seema, this topic, creating compassionate communities, was kind of given to me by Dr. Seema. And I believe it is also the theme of the World Hospice Day, right? I would like to kind of understand from both of you, what does it, because I think it can have a very different and a personal take, the topic itself. So what does it mean for each one of you personally and maybe professionally as well? So Krittika, would you like to go first?
Sure, I was hoping Dr. Seema would, but I can take a stab at it. I think for me, and it's funny, just before we started, I think I wrote one sentence. It was just on my mind before we started. And for me, I think talking about death makes life happen. And that's how I feel when I immerse myself in this space. That's what I feel when I speak to people like Dr. Nagesh and Dr. Seema. That's how I feel when I talk to people and hold space for them when it comes to talking about loss, grief, and death. Many times when we think of death, it's this one event, but loss is so much larger than it. So it's really about trying to unpack all of that and the spectrum of what it has. It's so complicated, but at the same time, it really ties back to life itself. And I find that for me creates space for love, appreciation, gratitude, connection, community, the topic that we're talking about today. Yeah.
Dr. Seema?
Yeah, thank you, Nidhi. I would like to speak from the healthcare perspective of what I think is a compassionate community, I think. So when we look at life, right, we sort of celebrate everything together, weddings, festivals, etc. But when it comes to sickness, ill health, death, dying, most of the time the families are struggling on their own. The individuals are, just like what you said, Nidhi, that when there is a bereavement, you find it difficult to talk, right? So slowly these individuals find that the support system dwindles away, especially when the suffering is prolonged. So for me, compassionate community means it's our ability to address the suffering. So it's not just death, dying, sickness. Everything is a social process. It's not a medical process. We've medicalized it so much and trust the healthcare provider to take the responsibility for it. Whereas it's only 20% of the things, it's the body that the healthcare provider can look after. The rest of it, the spirit, the mind, the practical issues, has to be looked after by the community.
So very well.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we talk about, it's like, Martin Luther King's thought comes into my mind. He says that we are all tied in an inescapable network of mutuality. So compassionate communities are those communities that have the attitude to look after each other, right? That have the knowledge and skills. It's not just enough to have the attitude. You have the attitude, Nidhi, to want to look after, but you don't have the skills and the knowledge of how to do it. Right? So it's important that we empower them with the skills, knowledge, and attitude to sustain yourself into that role of providing compassionate care to everyone in your community. It could be a small community, it could be your gated community. There are people who are suffering alone. The ability to be there for those individuals. Like my society, we celebrate Onam, we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Navaratri, but when it comes to sickness, right? Everybody is alone, coping on their own. So by being compassionate, we are sort of, empowering ourselves with the ability to look after those who are in the throes of suffering. For me, that is a compassionate community.
Yeah, that's very true. In fact, it just reminded me of something which I was at Christ University interacting with students from Department of Sociology and Social Work yesterday. These are kids who are pursuing their master's program. And we were talking about active aging and the issues of loneliness and isolation. And one quote which I had used in my presentation was from Dr. Stephanie, who says that we are a very social species. So even topics like loneliness, addressing those is a collective responsibility. It's not something which an individual can kind of solve for alone. So I think when it comes to, I think we are very good at being together when it's like good times to roll, but we are pathetic at dealing with anything which comes across as trauma or difficult to handle. We all shy away and run away from it. And while we may have like our own personal struggles to overcome such situations, but definitely it's a collective responsibility for those, all of us to have those compassionate communities, and we should all be a part of it. So I think that's wonderful. So Krittika, you'd run a program, an organization called Maajhi. Maajhi, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically someone who helps you cross the river. It's the boatsman, right?
Yeah, it's a ferryman.
Yeah. So what is Maajhi all about, and what do you offer through Maajhi?
So as you mentioned, Maajhi really focuses on the non-medical aspect of death and dying. And as Dr. Seema rightly said, community and people are such a large part of that conversation. And somehow death has sort of entered the hospitals, and we have started making it into such a medical conversation that sometimes the access to it only happens if you're sitting in a medical space. So the idea really was to bring it back into a community setting, and most importantly, start understanding how individuals look at death and dying. Start by thinking about how can you empower even one person, right? Because a community is a group of individual people who are coming together, or like-minded people who are coming together, and that really forms a community. So the idea really is to enable experiences, conversations, and even have tools that enable people to take that first step and hopefully go deeper and deeper into exploring loss and death and dying. So, for example, some of the offerings that we have, there's something called death meditation, which allows an individual to have an experience of what it means to die spiritually, from a body sense, from the sense of physically, medically, etc. And it's almost like, think about it as an extension of Shavasana, for example. You lie very still, and in that 1 hour, you're guided through what it means to die. And there are prompts asking you certain things about life. And that's really where it ties into the life you've lived. What are some of the gaps, if I, one can say it that way. And towards the end, what truly matters in this life that people are living, and what matters to them individually, for a community, for their aspirations, etc. We then have toolkits one is called The Last Dialogue. And this has really it's been built with everyone. In fact, it started as inspiration at Karunashraya itself. And we've had wisdom seekers, we've had artists, we've had therapists, we've had behavior scientists, we've had designers come in and put 21 questions together that help people start a conversation around loss. As you rightly said, sometimes when someone passes away or someone's going through a hard time, we tend to say, I'm really sorry for what's happening. And then we don't know what to say after that. But it's really a way to invite that conversation, say, okay, what else can I say? And what's really beautiful about sitting through some of these conversations or facilitating them or holding space for people is that we actually all know how to talk about these things. It's not that we don't know, we just don't practice it enough. And because all of us know how to be vulnerable, all of us know loss in some way. You don't need to experience death to know the experience of loss. You can have losses at multiple levels in your life. And that in itself starts becoming the connecting factor amongst all of us. And what is also really wonderful about when these offerings are sort of put on the table, what's really interesting is that when people start talking about death, the language around it changes. There's something, it almost, if I think about it visually, there's some kind of softening. There's like a diffusion that almost happens where people want to sort of take care of the language they're using. And they also want to hold that space for others. All these things come pretty naturally to us. And I think that is what Maajhi is trying to show, that you don't always need somebody else to do it. You need someone to empower you to do it, and then you're able to do it yourself. And so Maajhi really focuses on making sure that people and individuals or communities feel like they can do this. They've got this in a nutshell. And one of the other pieces that we've been working on is called Obituary to Self. It was a really interesting exercise where it was a social campaign that we did, where many times, an obituary is written when someone passes away. And so somebody else writes your obituary. So, you were a wonderful husband, or you were a great daughter, or you were a great wife, but it's not really your voice. It's somebody else writing your final story. And so we invited people to say that, you know what, you're alive. Why don't you write your own obituary? What will it look like? And the idea was to create a reflective journey by asking people how they'd like to be remembered. And it's really interesting because you're talking about an obituary, but most people wrote about this life that they lived, or at least imagined it. And what was so interesting is that by the end of it, people spoke about aspirations. They spoke about being loved, how they wanted to be remembered. Some people, and I'm really sorry for the companies that this happened to, some people quit their jobs, wanted to spend more time at home. Some people wanted to write a will. Somebody wanted to tell somebody how much they loved them. It just sort of created that quiet sense of self, plus the confidence that these moments are really important and we tend to forget about them. So Maajhi really tries to focus on the emotional, spiritual, mental aspects of this. And then, of course, there are wonderful collaborations that happen with places like Karunashraya or hospices in Toronto, where we can really focus on bringing some aspects of the medical and the emotional and the human side of it. And I think that is really where care kind of fuses and comes together. Yeah.
So I just have a question to that, like, how you describe it. I think it's a journey. It's a self-reflection journey, right? What I may assume is important to me, but on reflection, it may turn out to be something completely different, which is what probably led people to quit their jobs or completely change the track that they were on, right? So when you do these exercises or when you do the death meditation, have you ever encountered situations where somebody really may be afraid to even undergo that experience? They may experience a lot of resistance to doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, whenever I tell someone that I work in the space of death and dying, I'm really passionate about it. And, it's hard to not smile and be happy about the fact that this is something that I have found and I want to be in service of. Obviously, there's so much pushback of being like, are you okay? And, why do you want to go into this morbid space? And I think even I sort of started by being absolutely terrified about death. In fact, like when you were talking about your experience at home, I'm sure my parents were laughing about this because they are so death positive. I feel like I've gotten it from them. But when they used to talk about death before, I would get so upset and I would cry and it was just devastating because it just wasn't a construct that I wanted to explore and understand. And I think a lot of people start like that because, to your point, like people don't want to talk about difficult things. They don't want to think about what it would be like if their loved ones weren't here. And I think the fear is not so much about losing yourself, but I think one of the biggest fears we all have is losing our loved ones. And so that fear keeps building. And because of that uncertainty, even though, as Dr. Seema said, death is the only certainty, but how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, why it's going to happen, what happens after that, there's so much uncertainty around it that we tend to focus on that. And it's almost like your focus shifts from actually creating some of those spaces for those important conversations. And so I feel like a lot of people come to the table saying, what am I going to get out of this? Am I going to cry? Am I going to get upset? Like, well, that might happen. But, when I think of any time that I have sat in a space talking about loss or death, there is room for laughter, there's room for gratitude, there's room for love, because you're talking about people who you have loved who may not be there anymore. Or you might be talking about life lessons that you've taken forward because of them. So it's very hard to separate that as just something that is difficult versus something that is meaningful. And I think something about loss is something very iterative about it. And this is where my design thinking cap kind of comes on, because design thinking is iterative. You're constantly trying to understand how to make something better, how to keep pushing the envelope and taking it forward. I think death has that quality that the more you talk about it, the more you brainstorm about it, the more you enable it, the more comfortable you feel with it eventually. And I think that a lot of people, the first step is to say, okay, I don't want to talk, but I'll do a death meditation. It's like, fine, please come and do it. And the idea is also not to force people. I feel like, for example, today, if you had done this panel discussion and you hadn't told anyone about the topic, and suddenly you were like, we're going to talk about death. I mean, I'm sure you would have had a certain level of resistance. And I think this has been the biggest learning or design criteria when it comes to Maajhi, is that we invite people. There is no requirement for someone to feel forced in that space. They come when they're ready, and even if they're not, there is an understanding that we will hold space. But it's an invitation, and most of the times people come in because they're curious or something has happened which has initiated this conversation, and they don't know where to go or they don't know who to talk to about it. So I think people come from different spaces, but ultimately, I think what I have loved watching is actually seeing people feel like they can do this, and it actually lies within them. It's actually just igniting that more than teaching something. I think it's really about making sure that you're able to allow people to see that they have all of this and they can actually take action. So one can feel empowered to write a will. One can feel empowered to have a difficult conversation at home, or even think about their life differently.
Right. So I'll move on to Dr. Seema now. Dr. Seema, you are a palliative care specialist, but not everybody may be aware or understand palliative care. So could you tell us a little bit about palliative care and also about Karunashraya?
So thank you, Nidhi. And just like Krittika said, when Maajhi trying to bring about normalizing conversations about death in the, out there among the common persons, what palliative care does is normalize talking about death and dying in the healthcare settings as well. Right? It's when we talk about palliative care, it's a specialized medical care that is for patients, for people with serious illnesses. And what it focuses on is in improving the quality of life of the individuals with serious illnesses and their families. So just imagine somebody is diagnosed with a serious illness like cancer or maybe kidney failure or even, heart failure, etc. There's going to be a lot of complex needs that they have. One is regarding the disease, the treatments they undergo, the side effects, the physical aspect of it. And the other concept is about the fear, uncertainty, anxiety, the emotional component of this experience. And most of the time, some of the times, you end up questioning, why did this happen to me? What wrong have I done to deserve this suffering? So there are multiple dimensions to this experience. Physical, psychological, social, financial aspects to it. So palliative care is that branch of medicine which brings in a team of experts to provide specialized care for these individuals, to look after their physical aspects, their psychological, emotional health, their social difficulties, and as well as their spiritual suffering. So practically it is, and it's not only for the patients, but the family is also included in the circle of care. And Karunashraya, specializes in palliative care, and it's what we call as a hospice. Yeah.
So you're saying palliative care and hospice care is used interchangeably?
It is used interchangeably, but they are two different concepts. Though both palliative care as well as hospice looks after people with serious illnesses and tries to reduce their suffering in multiple domains, the one place where they differ is when we talk about palliative care occurs at the start or can start at the beginning of the diagnosis itself. Even when a disease is curable, if there is suffering involved along with that, like there is pain, palliative care begins at that point in time. When we talk about hospice care starts from the point the disease becomes incurable. Okay, and patients are nearing their end of life. Primarily in the last 6 to 12 months of the life, hospice care starts. So that is one difference between palliative and hospice care. When we talk about Karunashraya as a hospice, it's a standalone building where patients who are nearing their end of life are admitted for this holistic care, which may not be available in other hospitals, the healthcare settings that you see. Here you have a team of doctors, nurses, counselors, physiotherapists, and other allied health professionals and volunteers. And the caregiver, all are come together to care for the patients. That's what Krittika mentioned when she said, right, that it's a special type of care that comes in. And it's not only the physical aspects, the medications that we look after, a lot of creating awareness about death and dying, preparing for the death, encouraging families to accept, the patients as well as families to accept the concept of death and dying. We have a lot of conversations around it. Specifically, it's a death acceptance comes in, and we normalize that conversations, and we provide the supports so that we can ensure a peaceful death for the family and dignified death for the families.
Right.
So when we talk about palliative care, it's about caring, it's about compassion, it's about keeping them the patients and the family members comfortable. It's about dignity, and it's also about meaning making. creating legacy and meaning making for the patients and the family members. That's
So what are the
palliative.
most common misconceptions that you come across when you talk about palliative care? Because I'm sure there would be plenty.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest misconceptions when you talk about palliative care is that people think it's only for terminally ill patients, which is there is a distinction between end of life care and palliative care, or a hospice care and palliative care. Hospice care is part of palliative care, but palliative care begins at the time of diagnosis. Okay, so you don't have to have an incurable disease to come to palliative care. So that's one of the misconceptions. The second one being people think that it is meant only for patients with cancer. Palliative care means it's meant for cancer patients. It isn't. When you look at palliative care, anybody with any serious chronic illnesses, it could be stroke, it could be renal failure, as I said, it could be heart failure, it could be, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, what we call. Anybody who has suffering related to their health is eligible for palliative care. Even now, long COVID, patients with long COVID, with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, any of these, diseases can avail palliative care. The other thing, I think one of the commonest thing is you go to palliative care, it's about giving up. There is no treatment possible, hope is lost. That's the conception. It's not about losing hope, but it's about reframing hope. Okay, so what happens when cure is not possible? You will try to control the disease. What happens when you can't control the disease? Then what next? Okay, most of the doctors in hospitals will say, "Abhi kuch nahi ho sakta hai, ab ghar jaiye," right? But ghar jaane ke baad, even after going back, there is you will live for quite some time. So there are going to be symptoms. So you are going to feel anxious. There are going to be issues, emotional issues coming in. So this is where palliative care comes in to reduce your suffering, and it's about, when comfort providing, it tries to make you give you physical comfort, emotional comfort, and also helps you in that span of life that you are living to live as fully as possible and to find the sense of meaning when you know death is near. There is a journey that you make towards it, which is filled with finding meaning, purpose, and understanding why, there's a lot of reflection that comes in. And as Krittika rightly said, the thought about dying itself brings in a lot of gratitude, a search, quest for meaning, putting priorities right? Finding that sense of purpose to do what you want to do. So, but this is just when you think about it. When you actually face mortality, these things become more sharper, and you learn to live mindfully. And for that, you need support from that healthcare system, which is what we provide in our hospice. And that's why it's called the abode of compassion. Karunashraya means the abode of compassion, right? Where medicine, the art and science of medicine, join hands to provide a holistic care.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Seema. Thank you. Krittika, I'll come back to you. This was a question I already had in mind, and I also see it has been sent to me privately. The discussion that we've had so far is kind of focused on preparing people for death in time, in terms of conversations, or even palliative care also, for that matter, gives you a certain time duration to kind of come to terms with it, to cope up with it, right? But have you come across instances where somebody has faced sudden loss, an untimely death of a loved one, and for them it's a much more harsh situation where they haven't had time to really be prepared for it, and to so the coping mechanism is much longer and more difficult. So when somebody is haunted by such a situation, what is how do you kind of explain that? How do you deal with that? How do you help them out with this?
Yeah, I think as we were discussing a few days ago, when we were prepping for this call, I think that's one place where palliative care, or, just the healthcare system, it's so hard to access it, because it wasn't really part of that story. And sudden loss brings about I would say, a different level of shock and difficulty in acceptance because of, like you said, the suddenness of it. And, a person is always piecing back, but this happened and that happened. And of course, we all tend to rationalize as humans. That's what we do. But it's definitely a harder space because you're not sure how to access support. And in those cases, I think one of the things that we try to do at Maajhi is we don't try to distinguish which death is worse or which loss is worse. I think trying to create a comparison is unfair, because I feel like everyone has a certain kind of loss which is so deep for them that you can't really quantify it. You can't say somebody's loss is bigger or greater or any of that. And I think that is something that needs to go out of our language. And so when we sit together, there's an acknowledgement that everybody's loss is important and it depends on what they need. Many times what I'm looking for, because I don't have a healthcare background, but I try very hard to focus on the human element of it. I try very hard to focus on what that person needs to talk about. Maybe they want to talk about a memory. Maybe they want to talk about how difficult it is that because of the suddenness, there is all this practical paperwork that they're dealing with. Maybe they just want to talk about how angry they are that people are being insensitive around them. Again, these are not specific to somebody who's had a sudden loss. There's a very thin line. Like, yes, the event was sudden, but a lot of the emotions, the spectrum of that, understanding how to deal with different stages is pretty common. And so you're trying to help them understand that they're also not alone. And I think that is what happens with loss. We all tend to think that we are singled out and we're the only ones going through this. And so many times talking to people, and oftentimes I think this is where, the conversation of death over dinner or the last dialogue, it comes into play, because when you're sitting and sharing, you realize other people can relate to you, or you can relate to something about someone else that allows you to maybe take some comfort in it or be understood and be seen. I think we forget that we need to be seen during that time, despite the kind of emotions we have. One thing that I do oftentimes look out for, and this is where I feel like I appreciate being connected to medical professionals, is that if I see somebody really moving towards a space where they cannot function, which means they're not able to do their job, they are not able to manage their emotions, they are not being able to function, essentially. They're not being able to carry out their day-to-day activities. They don't seem to be getting over, or I don't want to say getting over, that's a wrong way of putting it, moving forward with the situation that they find themselves. Then it's really important to say, okay, does this person need professional help? Because maybe this is going into a space which is complicated grief. And complicated grief is really this, where you are unable to slowly start coming back to yourself or start moving towards a different version of yourself because of the loss. And that over time, you're building some level of resilience or understanding. If one sees that that's not happening, then that's the point where I ask if a person feels comfortable to maybe consider therapy. But again, like I said, I think it's sudden loss is definitely very hard in its own way, and it almost feels sectioned off compared to the other kinds of losses. But I think the journey overall is quite similar for people, just because of the kind of emotions you're going to find yourself feeling, the kind of logistics you have to go through, and maybe from a cultural and social space, what you're going through, which becomes the added layer. Like I think it's hard, even if you're going through a loss where other people are not supportive of you, or saying things which, like, oh, this person a better place now. What does that mean? I think it's I struggle when people say that, because you're not sure if, I know the other person's offering comfort, or they think they're offering comfort, but it can be taken in awful ways. In fact, sometimes that is more traumatic, or the lack of support or the bad support sometimes tends to be more traumatic than the event itself. And we've heard so many people say that. So it's really interesting to see how dialogue, support, community, all sort of come together, for this individual. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Krittika. That was, I think, very beautifully said. Dr. Seema, I'll come to you now because I have another, personal message to me, and I'll read it out. It says, unprepared loss is extremely difficult to deal with. Also, being a child who has to fulfill the traditional rituals of their parents' sudden death is something that nobody talks about. The Hindu ritual of burning the pyre of a dead parent is something that doesn't go off the mind for a very, very long time, and the person is still struggling with it. So I think, Dr. Seema, if you can actually, just continuing the thread from what Krittika started off with, can you talk to us a little bit about the whole concept of grief counseling? Because I'm not sure many people know about that there is such a field that exists, and there are professionals who are grief counselors who can actually help out an individual navigate this journey of grief.
Sure. So when we talk about grief, as Krittika said, grief is universal. We all feel it at some point or the other. We are going to experience it. But how we process that grief is very individualistic. It varies from person to person and depends on a lot of things. The nature of the loss actually does have an impact, of course, but the experience of grief is the same. For example, I very well knew that my uncle who recently passed away, when I left him in the ICU and came back home, I knew he's going to pass on at some point or the other. But when the news came in, right, when I knew he was no more, what hit me is the same as it would have hit at when somebody had gone away unexpectedly also. The intensity of the emotions were the same. And I was totally unprepared. I thought I was prepared for that experience, right? So many of us cope with it over a period of time. It takes quite some time, and it's very individual how long it is supposed to take. It's again very individualistic. You cope, you learn to live with the grief. You don't get over it, you learn to live with that pain. Right? But there is 10 to 20%, as Krittika mentioned, who are going to experience complicated, what we call as bereavement. And those 20% are the ones who need help from mental health professionals. And there is a subset of counselors who are trained in handling grief reactions. They journey and partner you in your experience of grief. They give you an authentic, safe space to express your emotions, and support you during that process. And the techniques used varies. Varies, right from empty chair technique. There are different techniques they use to help you process your emotions and handhold you through that process. Again, 10% of those would go into developing a mental health disorder like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have witnessed very traumatic deaths happening in front of your eyes, and would need medications as well. So while grief is a normal process that everybody goes through while suffering a loss, we have to be mindful, as Krittika said, that there are subsets who will require more specialized help.
Right. Thank you for sharing. Krittika, you were also presiding the death over dinner conversations in India for a brief period, right? Can you tell us a bit about that? What was that all about, and how was your experience running those sessions?
Sure. So death over dinner is a concept that was created by Michael Hebb and Angel Grant. This was in the US, I think, in 2013, where the idea was pretty simple, that we all come together, we gather for food, and, we tend to have a lot of conversations around the table. So it felt like a very forgiving space to have difficult conversations. We do it, and just like we said, that we tend to do it during celebrations in life, whether it's birthdays or anniversaries or Thanksgiving. But when it comes to loss, many times those conversations are isolated, let's say for a lawyer's office or a doctor's office, or it's done in, maybe with a counselor. It never really, and the idea was to bring it back into the community, as Dr. Seema was mentioning, that we've kind of pushed death into this medical environment, and we just want it to stay there, and we don't want to take ownership on it. And so the idea was, what if you bring people together over food and over conversation, and let's have let's have a conversation about death over a meal. And it's a very must say it's a very elegant concept. It's very simple. I think it's more important to make sure that the space is inviting, and there are series of prompts that are there which you can use for the table. So when we brought it to India, the idea was to understand how to customize it to the Indian audience. So keeping culture in mind, keeping religion in mind, keeping everything in mind, even though we tried to be as agnostic as possible, because again, death is universal, loss is universal. Every religion has something beautiful to say about it. So it was really about being inclusive about it. And we did dinners across 7 or 8 states. And it was always, a full party, I have to say that. And the idea really was that people would come together, they would sign up for it, we would have a really nice meal. In some cases, we even had chefs who were so interested in curating an experience that was even richer. That one of my favorite death over dinners was, we actually asked people what they would want as their last meal on earth. What would it be? And because food is such a huge part of comfort for us. And it was so interesting to see that most people opted for South Indian food. And at the end of it, the chef and I, we sat together and we curated this incredible sort of meal where everyone had their favorite things on the table. And I must say that the most surprising but not surprising dish on the table was bisi bele baat. We had a whole station of bisi bele baat, which I was just so impressed by. Of course, we couldn't get fancy Kobe beef and things for people. We were sorry, that's too much. You can get it yourself after this dinner. But it was so wonderful because it was pushing the envelope to get people to really feel like they have the room to have that conversation. But we also wanted to make it as experiential as possible. And we had people on the table ranging from the age of 21 all the way to people in their 80s. So it was always a wonderful spectrum of conversation, wisdom, experiences that would come together. And I think for a lot of people, it was very cathartic. For a lot of people, it was the first time they were even sitting and having a conversation about loss. Some people said, it's been 15 years that I lost someone and I didn't know who to talk to. And that's sometimes what we're dealing with. When we come back to that concept of loneliness, these conversations cannot be done in isolation. You can't suddenly have life all around you, and the minute you have loss, it's like you're singled out almost. And so I think it gave people the space to understand what kind of language can be used. I think it allowed people to think about what loss means to them. And I think what we used to do towards the end of the dinner was slowly start linking it to what it means for life itself, so that you're not leaving people on a sort of sad note, but really trying to link it to where they are in life, and what that means to them today. What does it mean when you talk about the loss of a loved one? What is coming out of it? What stays with you? Is it a memory? Is it a life lesson? Is it a sense of as Dr. Seema beautifully put it, I just made a note of it, of reframing hope, or just being okay with where you are. If you're unhappy, or if you're feeling grief, or if you're feeling anger, or if you're feeling like a situation was unfair, feel it. It's okay. It's okay to feel all those things in a space, because again, another thing about hiding loss, or, almost having a certain layer of shame with it, makes you feel like you can't feel these things. And so it was really a space to say, it's an open space, it's a safe space, nobody's recording anything, the conversation stays here, and we honor that as a group. And so it really allowed a person to understand what it means to sit in a space of community, to have that conversation. But I think 2 things that stood out to me. I think one of the questions that we would always ask is, we'd start by asking people what they think a good death is. And almost everyone turns around and says, oh, there's nothing like a good death. Death is bad. There's nothing good. There's nothing convenient. I think it would almost feel shocking, or in some cases insulting to people. But then you flip that question and you ask, okay, then what is a bad death? And then the answers start pouring in, right? Bad death is dying alone in an ICU with all the lights blinking and all those noises, and being around people who are masked and, or just not feeling dignified, having a slow, painful death, being absolutely alone, not having the finances to support you. So all of that slowly starts building. And then you go back to the question. So then what is a good death? And so the reframe of that is, oh, a good death is dying with dignity. It is about, saying what you need to say to your loved ones before you go. In so many cases, people have spoken about managing conflict, closing some of those chapters. So there's so many things that slowly start coming out, which in some ways are informing you of what is important to that person, what feels like dignity, what feels like empowerment to that person. And so the conversation slowly moves towards being able to say that, oh, I actually know what I want. I actually think I have preferences in this space. I do want to have these conversations. I do want to live in a way that builds more awareness. Or even if people come with a fear, it's about saying, okay, let's reframe that fear. What is that fear? And can you use that to actually create connection? Can I go up to my parent and say, I am so scared, I wouldn't know what to do when you're not here? It allows me to say that instead of feeling it and then acting like I'm okay and then not saying it and then regretting it and then having that sort of narrative build out. The second thing that stood out for me in Death Over Dinner, at the Death Over Dinner tables, I don't think I was at a single table where I didn't hear laughter. I think we always associate loss with sadness, anger, grief, shame, unfairness, and it almost sort of quietens you down. But I think the fact that you're talking about people that you've loved, that you've lost, people who've raised you, people who have made you who you are, it's so hard not to think about them fondly. Of course you're angry that they're not here. And of course it's unfair. So many aspects of life are unfair. And I know why my parents are smiling. I think I complain about unfairness a lot. But I think the other side of it is really that you're honoring those conversations. You're talking about someone who is no longer here, but that impacts you. And in some ways, interestingly, you keep that person alive. And I remember my mother saying this to me, that there are three times that people die. One is when they physically die. The second time is when, what we say, that their soul sort of goes. And the third time is when people stop talking about them. And I think that the power of talking about, whether it's your loss, whether it's talking about death in itself, is that you're keeping all these memories and you're keeping people alive. And this is why I think, when you come to a place like Karunashraya, or if you talk to people who are in the space of death and dying like all of us, I think I'm always amazed to see how much people smile and how people are so happy. It's not even about being happy. It's about feeling content. It's that sense of feeling very fulfilled and feeling empowered. I know I'm using that word.
I think that's a sense of liberation that you're talking about, when you've already encountered that fear and you feel that sense of freedom and prepared to challenge it or face that challenge, right?
But to add to that, I think what Dr. Seema said was also very important, is that you go through stages where, yes, you're getting more comfortable with the concept. Like Dr. Seema is so seasoned in that sense in terms of her career and what she does and how much she studied. But loss still affects us. It's not that it goes away. And I think that is also a misconception, that because you work in this space, you're fine with death and dying. Oh, it's okay if you lost someone. You know how to deal with it. You're like, yes, but you're still going to feel those things, and you might go through a really hard time just like anybody else. And I think that piece is very unpredictable, which is why community matters, which is why knowing what you want and who you are in that space matters.
No, in fact, it reminds me of an instance, what you were sharing just now. So I and my co-founder, Reshmi, we've written a book called Rethink Aging, which is based around the whole concept of active aging. And I was working on the chapter on spirituality and, how important role it plays on all of our lives. And so I was interviewing someone who said something which was, it hit me also very hard, because I said, I'm one of those who find it very difficult to have a conversation. So this was someone who had who suddenly lost her husband, and she was spiritually very evolved. So, so when that happened, she pretty much kind of took on the response. She had this, presence of mind that where she wanted to conduct her husband's last rites. So she had a spiritual teacher. She took him, her husband to the ashram in Pune from Hyderabad. She did all the last rites. There was something that she said. She said that, I was taking care of things and I was probably being very strong, but I really wish, people had come up to me and asked me how I was doing, or, offered some kind of solace. It's just that just because I was being strong, people kind of did not really offer me the comfort that probably I needed at that time. Right. So I think it kind of comes back to the same conversation that, how we all avoid, and that community part then really kind of completely dissolves because we really shy away from dealing it with ourselves. I think that impact on an individual who is not even directly related probably so strong that you completely shy away and run away from the situation, right? And something that you said about fully feeling the feeling is so important, to really let that feeling pass through, and even if it results in your crying or doing whatever you need to, it's perfectly all right. And I think that's really powerful and empowering. So thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Seema, I'll come back to you. We also talk about living wills here, right? And the Advanced Medical Directive. And I don't know how many people really know about it, but I would like you to, tell us in brief, what is a living will and why is it something that you would probably ask people to have? How does it help, especially the situations that you've been part of through your palliative care experience?
So I think living will is a will, I'm sure all of us know about will, right? We sort of write about where our financial aspects, we set things in order, isn't it? So living will is actually a legal written document that outlines your medical preferences. In case you're not able to take a decision, you become very sick and you're not able to take a medical decision about what type of medical treatment you want, you sort of put it down beforehand when you are quite well itself, and say whether you want cardiopulmonary resuscitation, what sort of medical treatment would you want. So it's actually a written document. You also put who is going to take this decision on your behalf. Right? When you are not able to mentally capable of taking that decision, either due to sickness or dementia or whatever it is, who's the proxy? Who is going to take these decisions for you? These are put down in a legal document, which is signed by witnesses. And, I think the next webinar that you are having will talk about the process of it. What it does is it sort of outlines what you want to do with your life. And as Krittika said, everybody wants a dignified death. Nobody wants to die alone. Nobody wants to, die attached to tubes, right? Masked. People prefer to die at home with loved ones by their side, with their physical sufferings taken care of, right? And so it helps you to outline all these things in the document. What we have seen is sometimes there's a lot of conflicts that happen within families when decision making comes, when there is no living will. Like, the daughter would want aggressive intervention. The son would say, no, my father would never want to live like that, right? So, and there is conflicts. And in families that make a decision of not escalating care or putting the family member on the ventilator, there is a lot of guilt. Did I do the right thing? Is that what actually that person wanted, right? So there's a lot of suffering that comes associated with those decision makings. So having this living will is something that makes it very clear to your loved one about what you want to do in times of medical crisis comes in, what they need to do. So I think it's very imperative that you don't wait until illness strikes, right? For a simple example is, we don't know what happened to Schumacher, right? Yeah. A racing legend. He survived high-risk environment of racing, goes for a holiday, has a fall, and goes into a almost vegetative state. So anything can happen to us at any point in time, right? So having our wishes outlined sort of is one of those things that you prepare for that eventuality when it comes. Doesn't mean that you make a will and you're going to, something bad is going to happen, which sort of the fear that all of us carry with us, But one thing is, as Krittika rightly said, there is no good death. But when you talk about a peaceful death, it is being aware of the death is eventuality. It's about being accepting it as an eventuality in our life and preparing for it, right? Even for a simple thing as going for a higher studies or getting married, right? Which are all uncertain events out there. We have prepare for it, right? In the future, when my daughter is going to get married, I have to make money. We keep on preparing for all these things. But as I keep saying, the only eventuality, certainty that is there is that death. But we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to even think about it, right? Even when patients are dying, when doctors tell you that there is no more treatment available, we still don't want to talk about it. And there is a name for it. It's called as thanatophobia, right? Refusal to look at it. We are looking the other way, right? So, and in order to, one of the things that we need to normalize these conversations is about creating this living will document, which gives a clear indication to your family what you want and what you don't want. It makes decision making easier for them. It'll help your loved one to, have a uncomplicated grief and bereavement because they know that they are doing what you wish them to do.
Yeah, thank
Right?
you. Yeah, so it's almost like it's time to stop being the ostrich, digging our head in the soil. And yeah. So one last question from my side before I pick up questions from the audience to both of you. I know that you work in this space, so you are doing this as part of your work, professional environments. But is this a conversation that you have had with your loved ones, and what kind of acceptance or resistance did you face there? So Krittika, would you like to go first?
I'd like to say that the resistance all came from me. I don't think the resistance has ever come from my family. My father has, served in the armed forces. My mother is an armed forces wife and, mother to us. And I think there's always been very practical conversations about loss. There's been a lot of learning around loss in our family. And I think we've taken all of that along in, I would like to say, the most graceful way possible. And I'm very grateful for that because I think it's very hard to find that. I don't think I realized it till I realized how resistant so many people are. Like you said, just saying the D word is like, it's as taboo as talking about sex. It's like, there's something about it that just makes everyone so uncomfortable, or they think you're bringing it on, or you're trying to create a depressing environment. I think we've always been open to having conversations about death and loss. And I think what's been interesting is that, initially the conversations were, I guess, a little more carefully curated. And then over time, you're able to bring in the jokes, and you're able to bring in the lightness, and you're able to bring in the care that is required. Like, as Dr. Seema was saying, talking about loss can actually do so much, or being prepared for it can do so much. Like, for one, reducing complicated grief, that is huge. Knowing that you're honoring somebody's wishes, that is going to change the way you are going to think about them when they're not here. And that's also going to be a way that you think about yourself and whether you did enough. A large part of what we are left with is wondering whether we did enough. And I think so much of that sort of goes away when you have these conversations. And, just like any other topic, it has room for everything. It has room for humor. It has room for sensitive moments. It has room for building memories. It has room for active conversation, saying, and my father has actually created his own format for a living will. And I know that there was a lawyer who was very excited about it because he found the format so good that now my father's distributing that format. But I think just even going through that and saying, what does my family feel about it? I think my parents have had this wonderful ability to come back to us and say, this is what I've written. What do you think about it? What do you feel about it? So then it starts feeling like collective decision making. And this is
I
really
think it
where
made it much easier for you.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think that this is where community comes in. Your community is not always a gated community and all your neighbors. It's sometimes your community is sitting within your house. and being aware of what they want and being able to discuss it, being able to say, but I'm fearing this. Can we talk about this? It's an exchange. It's not just about one person saying, here's my living will, deal with it, bye. It's really about saying, let's co-create it. And so many of these decisions that we make, we think we have to do it in isolation. We really don't have to. And I think this is what allows for connection to happen. This is really the space where understanding happens. And I think we miss out on all of that good stuff when we don't talk about the difficult things.
But yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah. So this happened, I guess, of course, we've been in the space. I've been working for the last decade, more than a decade now. And my parents are in their late 70s and 80s, So we did have on and off conversations, though not as Krittika mentioned, not as elaborate, but sufficient enough for me to know what their needs are and their wants are. Having said that, when COVID happened, both me and my husband are both doctors working in this space. We had a more detailed conversation within ourselves because both of us were out there, and we as well, like we were at the high risk category. We didn't know. My husband was in Mumbai. I am in Manipal, working in hospitals. Both of us are exposed to it. At that point, we did have a conversation among ourselves about what we wanted and what we didn't want. Even at that age, in the first wave happened, we knew going on a ventilator would mean that you would, either have wouldn't come back, wouldn't have quality of life. The second wave was different. The first wave, we didn't have any medications at that point in time. We did have a conversation. Our son was in Germany. We did have a sort of we listed out everything what we had financially, as well as what we wanted, in terms of the decisions that need be taken, and we mailed it out to him. He was petrified out there, poor boy, but he was in his 23, 24 at that point in time. But we did have this open conversation because that is something that you learn when you are in this field. It's better to have this conversation and be prepared than have it happen to you suddenly, right? Because you are leaving the one after you with a lot of conflicts when it comes to decision making. So I just saw a question in the chat about whether it is ethical to have this conversation with patients or not. I'm just saying, so just yesterday, we have this patient in Karunashraya whom I have been having a conversation with about death, about dying, who very well knows what's happening to her. And she expressed a wish that she had learned Veena about 12 years back. And she wanted to, play that music before she dies, once at least. So we happened to get somebody into Karunashraya, and yesterday was a beautiful moment in the evening where we had a Veena. That lady played the Veena, and the patient herself took the Veena in her hand and strummed some music. At the end of it, today when I met her, she said, "Now I can go in peace." Right? This is what having those conversations helps, it helps the individuals prepare for their dying. And it also helps us to, there are sometimes conflicts that need to be resolved, it's a task. Dying is a task. Just like, as I said, you have, it's a developmental task. Children grow, isn't it? They learn to walk. Similarly, death is also a developmental task. For some, it comes before time. For some, it comes at the right time. But whenever it comes, there is certain things that you have to complete before you die peacefully. I wouldn't say it's a good death, but before you die peacefully. And those is like, it's about asking forgiveness, forgiving others. It's about completing these unfulfilled businesses, the unfinished businesses, saying your goodbyes. There are a lot of things that has to be put in place. And having and talking about death gives you an opportunity to fulfill these tasks. And, in order to die well, you need to live well. So it works the other way around. When you watch people dying, you also learn from them how to live as well.
Thank you. That's ending it on a very powerful note. So let me just quickly move on to the questions. We are already over time. So, Krittika, I think you should probably tell us how people can reach out to Maajhi, because somebody has asked, does Maajhi have a branch in Mumbai? So can you tell us how people can reach out to Maajhi?
They can reach out on the website. I can post it here.
Yeah, please do that. Yeah. So just would you like to let people know that it's usually done online, the sessions and everything?
Yeah, most of it is done online, so it's accessible across the globe.
Right. Thank you. Now there is a question. In fact, it is kind of taking a leaf from what you had just said, Dr. Seema. Mr. Rao says he's 85 years young. He says, I'm a yoga specialist. Does healthy aging result in a safe death? What would you say to that?
So I'll quote statistics here, forgive me. So safe death in the sense, it varies, isn't it, for different people. But if you mean a death without suffering, without disease, sudden death, what we call it, it's hardly 10% of the population who have sudden death. Right? 90% will get diagnosed with some illness, or it will be slow dwindling with age, and death happens that way. So a healthy living, I think it is for the well-being, it is equally important. But whether it will contribute to a safe death or not, I don't know actually.
True.
It will help you live well, and that's for definite.
Surely. Krittika, this one is for you. Is death experience and after death, what next, also a topic that is discussed during your conversations?
Sometimes, yes. Like I said, it's an open space. I think people come in with whatever they want to talk about. And many times when we think of afterlife, either people are imagining what it is. I definitely try and think about what that is a lot. And sometimes it's attached to your religious beliefs or your cultural beliefs. So there's room to have those conversations. But just wanted to understand a little more in context. Is it more in terms of coping, or is it?
I'm guessing it's more of a topic that it could be out of curiosity, or it could actually be related to a situation where somebody may be looking for answers while coping with that grief. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's all part of the subject. Yes.
Yeah. So, Dr. Seema, you kind of already addressed this question, but would you want to say anything additionally to the part that, is it correct to tell the patient, and also family, that you're dying? Is it ethically correct?
Yeah. So coming to medical ethics, yes, it is. It's about having honest conversations with the patient is extremely important, as well as with the caregivers. It's extremely important. So it's a moral and an ethical right of every doctor to be authentic and have a honest conversation. But having said that, there are some circumstances, where you weigh in whether having this conversation is going to cause more harm, or is it going to be beneficial. If from your experience you feel it is going to cause more harm, then probably that is the space that you will not venture into. So one of the primary ethics of any doctor is to do no harm. Right? So though majority of the time there is an ethical and moral duty of the doctor to have this honest conversation, it also is very contextual, depending upon whether having this conversation actually benefits the patient or not. It depends on that. There is a direct question to me, which has come in. The language for offering comfort to a grieving father who has just lost his grown-up son. Is it universal, or does it have to be customized depending on the father's personality? Secondly, when should one cease crowding that person so that he can come to terms with that loss in his private moments? Any pointers? See, there's no, the language of grief can be very different. Okay. And different people react differently to, the terminologies that you use. From what I think the best language is nonverbal. It's one of being there with the person. It is that what we call as accompaniment. Sometimes the very silence of just being available, being there with the person without speaking, maybe just holding the hands or sitting with them, that itself is conveys the empathy and compassion that you want to. We want to fill in and try to fix things using appropriate words. Sometimes you are just at the loss for words, the loss of a grown son can be, for a parent, it can be a huge loss, isn't it? So just empathizing, being authentic in that moment without rehearsing what you have to say, and just being there for that person is very important. When we talk about crowding, you don't have to be in the space of the person, but you can be in the periphery doing things that that person needs. You could cook a meal and give it. Instead of asking, do you want something, you could look what that person wants, probably going and buying groceries and keeping it out at the doorstep, probably going and filling that electricity bill for that person. So these tangible things which you can do from the periphery, so that the person is given the space to grieve on their own while the routine mundane things are taken care of. That could be a big support for that individual. So you don't have to actually have plenty of words or language to express your empathy and compassion. You just have to be your authentic self. You need to just be able to put yourself into other person's shoes and probably feel what that other person is feeling and be there for them.
Thank you. Krittika, I just wanted to again, had a question which I think I missed. So you are a non-medical professional, as you said, you're not a healthcare professional. So what prompted you to get into this space? Because I know doctors choose their specializations. What was your reason?
So my reason's actually on the call right now. Many years ago, my father was in a difficult medical situation, and I think overnight, it just changed. It just changed our lives, and I think that overnight one sort of had to come up, and this was way before I started working in the space of death and dying. I had a very different profession at that time. I was a musician, a professional musician and a textile designer, just had nothing to do with anything around death and dying. And when the news came to me, I think it was the way the news was given to me and everything that happened after it, which was months of, either dealing with the medical system, trying to navigate that system, trying to understand, what does this mean for the family? What does this mean for my father? What does this mean? It kind of just makes everything turn around. And overnight you are a caregiver, but you don't really know how to be one because nobody teaches you. Overnight you have to have difficult conversations, but like nobody's taught you again. There's a huge growth period that kind of happens, and you're dealing with the fear that you can lose someone. And there's so much that's going on. And I think while medically, I think we had, we were fortunate to have good facilities, and one tends to recover faster and faster today because of those improvements in technology and medicine. I don't think anything prepared me to understand emotionally what to do. And I often think that these conversations, again, they lie in the hospital, and somewhere you almost had to be qualified to have these conversations or to even learn how to be prepared for it. And so that made me start thinking. And at that time I still am a designer. And I think so much of design thinking is looking at problem solving from a human-centered lens. And I thought, how can I use this opportunity to, I'm not a healthcare professional, but how can I get into this space anyway without, requiring all this time to study and, really equip myself from a medical perspective. And so that journey sort of started in terms of bringing design, behavior science, a topic like death and dying, systems thinking, understanding stakeholders within the system to really understand how I could get into this space firstly, and then how could it be something that I could serve through. And I think it just became a passion project. It became something that never left me because that situation had such a profound impact on me that it changed the course of my life. I can say that very easily. And I immediately quit everything, went for a master's program, and continued working in this space. So it's been almost 10 years now that I've been exploring the space of end-of-life care, and I don't think I'm going to stop at all.
I think you are doing a wonderful job and a very noble one at that. And if we, with your permission, can I bring in your father? Because I think he's been the constant inspiration behind the work that you've been doing. So shall I bring him in? Yeah.
Please, if he's okay with it. Yep.
Yeah. So can I bring you in? Hello. You're on mute if you can.
I've unmuted myself. Thank you for this opportunity. Well, I've been, I must say that our parents, we've been very proud parents of seeing how Krittika has grown in front of our eyes. And we are very, very grateful for all you supporters who have helped her along this journey. And we are very proud that she's in this space. Personally, I'm very fortunate. And like she had mentioned, although we've been through a pretty serious medical downside, but we've come out of it thanks to professionals, dedicated professionals like we see in front of us today. So thank you very much for including me. And I know that the job you are doing, whether or not I've been in that space, but I know how much it means to all those people who, A, either do not have somebody, B, because today life is such that nobody really has the time to understand empathy, leave alone share it and practice it with those who really need it. So thank you all for being there, and thank you for having me with you.
Thank you so much for those kind words. Thank you. And if I may have a fangirl moment here with you, I very fondly remember watching the entire program when you were in the space, and your conversation with Indira Gandhi ji, and your answer was so beautiful when you said "Sare jahan se acha." Can you say that for me once? How does India look from the outer space?
Well, बिना किसी झिझक के बता सकता हूँ सारे जहां से अच्छा.
Really? So beautiful.
Really. Yeah, and there is no rethink on that. I truly believe that we belong to a great nation, and we are probably beginning to realize our potential. And I think the whole world needs what we are, our Indianness, what we used to be. Of course, we do need to rediscover ourselves, and empathy is going to play a great part, and that's right down your street, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So for all of you, that was Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma joining us today. Krittika is his very blessed daughter, and I think both of you feel proud of each other. So there's nothing for us to say to that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Seema. It has been a pleasure and an honor to speaking to you both today. And Dr. Nagesh, thank you so much for making this happen. So beautiful. I'm really feeling very moved and almost have goosebumps right now ending this conversation. So it has been one of the most beautiful conversations that I have had in my last 10 years of my career with Silver Talkies. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.